Welcome back, all of us, after lunchtime. Now we have an hour, what we call a sort of training session. And there are two speakers in the training session. One is Jeroen de Ridder. He's a professor in Groningen and here in Amsterdam. He does mainly work, or he did a lot of work in philosophy of technology, but now he does mainly philosophy or social epistemology. As a matter of fact, he is one of the starters of an important and really interesting subfield of epistemology, political epistemology, and he published the Routledge Handbook of Political Epistemology, which is a swell work, I can tell, because I read many articles, many chapters in it. And there's another voluminous book, Social Virtual Epistemology, that he edited with Mark Alfano and Colin Klein and so Jeroen. So he's well connected in the field. He knows a lot, and he has a very, what I always think as a very smooth style of presentation. There are no details not properly dealt with in his presentation. So he's going to talk about research funding and interdisciplinarity. It'll take about 30 minutes. And then he will be succeeded by Rick Pils, as I thought would be the case. By Nora Kinderman. She's a PhD candidate in our department, and she works in this ERC project on extreme beliefs. And she's going to tell us a bit about finding literature, scoping reviews, systematic reviews, how that works, what are the works or possibilities, and also the liabilities that you may encounter. I'm going to stop in order to give you the report.
Sure.
Do you want to keep these books in your hand all the time?
No. All right. Thanks so much, Renee. And so does this mic actually do anything? Yeah, you do. Okay. Do I need to speak really quick? That makes a difference. But you can hear me all right if I speak like this. Okay, good. Thanks for that lovely introduction. So it sort of raised the bar in terms of my presentation style. So I'm not quite sure what I want to do now. But I thought, since this is a training session, we're going to switch gears a little bit. So I'm not going to talk about philosophy all that much. Instead, I'm going to talk about research funding in the Netherlands, which is something that I've spent a good part of my past 5 years trying to understand as a member of the Young Academy. And it's actually, so I'm going to try and convey like the key things that I learned in the past 5 years in the next 30 minutes. So, you don't have to spend your part of 5 years of your life trying to figure all that out. So there's actually, and the reason, of course, why I want to talk about this is that, when you're interested in doing philosophy and doing research in philosophy, it can help to learn about the system in which all of that takes place. So I thought it would make sense to share some of that knowledge. Okay, so, and maybe to some extent, some of this might be familiar to some of you. It depends on how much you sort of follow science policy and science funding news, but then, I'm hoping there's something in there for everyone. Okay, and then this will eventually sort of end in, well, actually a motivation for why you might want to also think about doing interdisciplinary research, which is then sort of the bridge to Nora's talk. So you know what's coming. Okay, so here's the basics of Dutch science funding. There's basically three, what they call streams of funding in research. First, second, and third. Not very creative names. The first stream is basically the money that comes directly from the government, from the Ministry of Education, Research, and Culture. The second is the money that is distributed through the Dutch Research Council, NWO. And the third is money that comes from other sources. So it can either be European sources, the European Research Council, or public and private organizations that fund research in the Netherlands. So in terms of the size of the whole system and who's doing the research, I thought it might be interesting to give you some of the numbers. And so, as I'm sure you all know, the people that do the research, the people who do the research are, of course, the PhD students, postdocs, and people who have research-only positions, and then the assistant, associate, and full professors. Now, it's hard to get the exact numbers for philosophy, because this is all sort of aggregated into higher levels. But here at the right of your screen, where you can only see some of the numbers, but this is for sort of an area of disciplines, a whole group of disciplines, humanities and linguistics, and this is philosophy as part of that. So you can actually look at the numbers there represent the number of people working in that broad area. And when you look at the different positions, I mean, one thing you might think, well, that's not necessarily a lot of people. We have 14 universities in the Netherlands, and this is like humanities and linguistics all combined. So when you think about philosophy, that's actually a relatively small discipline within that. So, the numbers of assistant, associate, and full professors are not that big. When you work as an assistant or associate professor, you get some default research time from that first stream funding. But usually in most positions, that's 20 to maximally 40% of your time. So basically 1 or 2 days a week. So you might be interested in finding external sources of funding, which is of course why a lot of people try and apply for grants. Because 1 or 2 days a week is not nothing, but it's also not a lot. And of course, the rest of your time you spend teaching, sitting on committees, or doing other sort of admin work. Okay, so in terms of the total size of the entire system here, so what is the amount of money that goes into research funding directly from the government? And this is just about research, it's not about education. So the second column there is the most relevant one. So the source of funding from the government is obviously the biggest one. And basically it's about 4 billion euros that go into higher education and research in that. And then there's also about 800 million that goes to research institutions. So that includes the Royal Academy and the Dutch Research Council. Both have a whole group of research institutes. I don't think a lot of philosophers work there. It's mostly different disciplines. But these are, pretty big numbers, but of course, it's a lot of people. And when you look at the total picture, social sciences and humanities is usually the smallest of the big areas. Okay, so let's zoom in on the Dutch Research Council. Because one thing I've learned is that a lot of people are frustrated with the Dutch Research Council. I am sometimes a bit frustrated with them as well, which is why I joined them now. A lot of people sort of project their worries onto the Dutch Research Council, and this is understandable, because it always looks like they're against you. They never want to give you any money, and we have all these brilliant ideas, but they just never want to fund them, or very rarely. There's a reason for that, and that reason has, of course, to do with their budget. Their total budget is about 1 billion, slightly less. Just more than half of that is actually spent on funding research. The other part goes to their research institutes, goes to sort of designated things that they need to support. So it's not sort of up to them to spend it on other things. The government just gives them that money, and then they just have to pass it along. So there's nothing I have to say about that. So in that 520 million euros per year, there are some different things that they do. the most important thing, I think, for philosophy typically is their open research programs. And this is basically where you just come up with your own projects, your own ideas, and you try to acquire funding for them. And they have two basic instruments for that. One is their talent program, which includes things you may have heard of, the Rubicon, the Veni, Vidi, Vici programs, and Spinoza prizes. That's the one leg. The other leg is the open competition, and you see the budget there for both those. And then, in addition, they have various programs that are focused more on thematic research. So there, the idea is this is sort of, I mean, okay, so there's different things I want to say. One is the National Research Agenda, which you may have heard of. I mean, it consists of largely of sort of big consortia that apply for thematic research, where a lot of the times, most of the money goes to engineers, natural scientists, biomedical research, stuff that's slightly easier to apply in the real world than philosophy. Same holds for the Knowledge and Innovation Covenant. That's another big budget, which a large part of it comes from the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And that is sort of really focused on innovation, R&D. So sort of stuff that's easily, or at least people expect to translate easily into things that make money. So it's very sort of dominated by economic affairs. So also difficult for philosophers to find funding there. So basically, what I'm saying is that as a philosopher, you're stuck with, or you need to look at the open research thing, where there's all these programs. And I mean, they're wonderful programs, right? I mean, if you get money from them, you basically get a lot of research time to work on things that you find interesting. When you're a little more further in your career, you might be able to hire PhD students or postdocs. So this is wonderful. But I mean, keep in mind, the acceptance rates for these things tend to be around 10 to 15%. So that's, you know, not necessarily something to be very excited about. Right? It just means that 8 out of 10 get rejected of proposals that are submitted. Okay, so that's the Dutch Research Council. Then there's a number of things that have been happening because of the new government, last year. There's actually good news, which is that the government is pouring a lot of extra money into research. And I thought I would tell you a little bit about how they do that. So there's one thing, again, you may have heard of this. This is called the sector plans. So here the idea is the government wants to sort of give money to universities in the Netherlands, social sciences, humanities. So that's one big cluster, and then same thing for natural sciences and other branches of research. They don't want to sort of determine top-down where universities should spend that money on. Instead, they've basically asked universities and faculties, departments in the social sciences and humanities to come up with a plan for how they want to spend that money. So the thought is, we give them that money on the condition that they come up with a good plan to spend it. So what's been happening is that the Social Science and Humanities Council, the SSH-raad, for those who speak Dutch, which is more or less a bunch of deans, they came up with this plan in which they thought of a number of, sort of key areas, priority areas, where they want to hire new people. And on the slide there, you see the key areas for the humanities. So they are humane AI, cultural heritage and identity, and the third one is languages and cultures. And then there is a cross-cutting theme, welfare, participation, and citizenship in a digital world. And this is cross-cutting in the sense that it's supposed to combine social sciences and humanities. And you might think these are pretty broad themes. You would be right. I mean, that's the idea, right? I mean, this is supposed to cover a lot of research areas and a lot of possible ideas and projects. But the nice thing obviously is there's 24 million euros per year for the humanities only, and then another 17 million for these cross-cutting projects. So that basically means in the next couple of years, we're going to see a lot of activity in those areas. So where does philosophy fit in there? Well, you know, it's not necessarily easy to see. I mean, you might think, depending on your area of philosophy, that there's work under humane AI or cultural heritage, language culture, or maybe if you do philosophy of language or cultural philosophy, philosophy of culture. But as you might guess from these areas, philosophy wasn't very well represented in the SSH Council. So they didn't get a big voice in determining these priority areas. But still, I mean, this is where the money is going over the next couple of years. So it's something to think about if you're interested in an academic career. Then there's a final thing I want to mention. Another part of the money that the government is spending on universities. They've begun this program which they call starters and stimulation grants. And these are basically grants for people who either get tenure or are promoted to a higher academic rank. The government is spending 300 million euros annually on that, which again is a pretty big sum. Division there tells you which part goes to which program. The idea is people who get a permanent position, so who get tenure, so this could be at the end of a tenure track position, or depending on your university, it might be a different sort of situation. The idea is you get 300,000 euros as a researcher, which you can spend basically on whatever you want. So you can hire PhD students, you can buy yourself out of some teaching time, do more research yourself. So it's a lovely program. It's also creating some difficulties because there isn't enough money for every new person who gets tenure, for every promotion. So as you might guess, there's problems here about who is getting this money, how is it distributed, what's a fair way of doing it. And the tricky thing is that this isn't centrally coordinated, so universities are doing different things. So some universities basically run with this idea, so they give it to individuals. Other universities say, well, we just, we accept the total amount and then we spread it out evenly over all researchers that we have. So it's creating kind of a messy situation in some ways. Or at least it's an unequal situation. I mean, in one university, you might basically get 300,000 euros when you get a tenured position, in another one, not, which is a bummer for the second person. All right. So this is sort of, in a nutshell, some of the key things in Dutch research funding. If you want to look at these numbers more carefully, and longer than 15 minutes, here are some websites that you may want to visit. And are we sharing the presentations with all of you? I don't know if that's sort of a thing that I'm happy to sort of send this to all of you in case you want to look into it. Okay, so let me end with some more sort of try and apply this a bit more to, what does this mean if you're thinking about an academic career? What are some of the things you want to think about? Well, one thing, and this is, it might sound a bit trivial because maybe it's true about anything you want to do, but it's a good idea to sort of be realistic about the numbers and the odds, right? The numbers I just showed you give you an impression of the size of philosophy in the bigger research landscape in the Netherlands. They give you an impression of the number of positions that there are, the positions that have research time, ones that don't, how hard it can be to get more research time if you want that. So when you're considering pursuing an academic career, this is something to be aware of, right? An academic career is certainly not this heavenly situation where you just get to sit in your armchair and think philosophy all the time. That's not what happens. Another thing is you want to be strategic about this. So given that this is like the situation in the landscape, given the relative scarcity of possible positions, if you're interested in this, seriously interested, you want to sort of start early with thinking about it and talking about it, talking with your supervisors, talking with PhD students, with young assistant professors, just to get a sense of what it's like, a sense of, what is it that these people do and how did they get where they are? What was important for them? What did they learn in the process? You also want to be sort of assertive about your ambitions. Not too aggressive, perhaps, but if you're interested in an academic career, you have to let people know. So it's not as if you do really good philosophy, somebody's going to come up to you and tell you, hey, I now want to hire you. You want to be explicit about this, right? Plan ahead, right? So there are grant programs for PhDs in humanities, philosophy PhDs. There are programs for when you're further along in your career. For all of these programs, your CV is going to be important. So again, maybe this is all very trivial sounding, but you want to think about, well, if I want to apply to a grant in a couple of years, what does my CV need to look like? You can ask other people about that. Most universities have subsidy advisors who can tell you more about this. But if you don't think a little bit about this in advance, chances are you're not going to do great. And sure, there may be exceptions. I mean, some people are just brilliant and they sort of breeze through, but that's not the norm, right? If you're interested in this, be strategic about it and plan ahead. Another thing, and this sort of gets me to the end of what I wanted to say, is that it can be important to hedge your bets a little bit. So don't get too hung up on the idea of I need to have an academic career or else my life will be over, because that's not true. Right? I mean, there's lots of stuff to do outside academia, lots of interesting stuff, lots of entertaining stuff. I don't know how many of you are even thinking about an academic career, but I mean, it's important to keep this in mind. And not only think about it, but maybe also explore it a little bit, right? So talk to people who've left academia or talk to people who never tried to enter academia in the first place, learn about what they do. Just, send people emails in organizations that you're interested in, ask them if you can talk to them or maybe, spend a day there. Most people like it when you show an interest in what they do, right? So most people tend to be sort of welcoming about these inquiries. And this is really the final thing here, which is the bridge to Nora. So philosophy is great, right? I mean, I'm not at all trying to dissuade you or discourage you from doing philosophy, but so is interdisciplinary research. So especially in this sort of situation where you saw before that a lot of funding goes to thematic programs that aren't specifically aimed at philosophers. There's these focus areas from the sector plans, humane AI, cultural heritage and identity and languages and culture. These aren't sort of a one-on-one fit with philosophy. So if you can think about ways in which your interest in philosophy connect with other disciplines, that's going to be helpful. And that doesn't mean you need to sort of move out of philosophy and forget about the fundamental philosophical questions that you're interested in. It can help to think about how those interests you have connect with interests in other disciplines. So, find people in different disciplines. I mean, there's research master students, PhD students in all your universities, plenty of them. Talk to them, right? And who knows, you might find interesting connections between what they do and what you do. And usually this takes some time. I mean, I've experienced myself when you want to collaborate with people from a different discipline, you need to, spend time with them, learn their language, and vice versa, of course. So invest in that and think about how you see connections and possible collaborations there, because that might set you apart from the average applicant or the average candidate later on. If you have these interdisciplinary connections and interests, maybe you published a paper together with someone from another discipline, that's interesting. Committees and grant committees, they like that. All right, so this was, in a way, this was sort of a weird talk for me to give, because I do realize it all sounds very sort of strategic and maybe a bit dirty. But I'm just trying to sort of convey a sense of realism here about what academia is like. So I hope that's been helpful. I think I'm out of time. Oh, I have a couple of minutes left, maybe for questions. If someone has questions, go ahead. Yeah.
Organization or a company to ask for money for research, something like that?
Yeah, so I think are there other possibilities for funding sort of outside the research council? And for philosophy, that's pretty rare. I mean, there's a few international organizations, so Renee and a number of others. We've got money from the Templeton Foundation, which is a big American organization. So that's one. There, I mean, other countries obviously have their research councils or endowments for the humanities and so on. But I think, I mean, I'm also sort of looking at my colleagues here, but I mean, it's hard for philosophy. So I think you'd have to, yeah, I mean, that would be something to explore yourself, but you'd have to have a really, compelling proposal. And most of the times, I mean, even my colleagues in engineering or the natural sciences, they tell me they have a hard job sort of getting money for their research from companies, whereas what they do is obviously much closer to being applicable than what I tend to do. So that's tricky.
Je zou het voorbeeld van Geert-Jan Hoofdweg kunnen doen.
Oh yeah, so that's a good example. So there's one recent graduate of our PhD program who works at the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And he basically did his PhD part-time. So he was a PhD student with us, but also working, I think, 4 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days at the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And the interesting thing is that for the ministry, they actually sort of stimulated him in pursuing the PhD. So they basically gave him 1 day a week. 1 day? Was it 1.5?
And 2 days.
Okay, 1 or 2 days a week to work on his PhD here with us in Amsterdam. So that was nice. So there are some organizations who sort of stimulate people pursuing research, getting a PhD. So that's one thing that sometimes happens. And there's similar programs. I mean, they are actually funded by the Research Council for high school teachers who want to get a PhD. So you can apply for money, the Dutch Research Council, for 2 days a week to work on a PhD project. Sure.
So, after becoming life and I find around that.
Yeah.
Does do you need to have any extra money besides the money you pay yourself?
No, so it varies maybe a little bit per university, but in most Dutch universities, as far as I know, being an external PhD candidate is basically free, or sometimes there's a small admin fee, maybe 100 euros per year, but that's about it. So you just need to have the qualifications and some independent source of income to sustain yourself, as you say. But yeah, and of course you need to have enough time on your hands to actually do the work, obviously. But yeah, and so I mean, it's a thing that people do successfully, but experience also teaches us that it can be difficult for people and it can take a long time. But of course, that's hardly a surprise if you're doing something that's difficult in your own time. Yeah.
Does it also occur that, for example, you have 3 people and those 3 people, they want to, then do a research proposal? The main applicant is not a philosopher, but the research has like a philosophical aspect to it.
Yeah.
Does it then occur that the entire applicant or the entire research proposal is done in a domain not philosophical, and then you get money from that to do something philosophical?
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, so there's definitely collaborations between people from other disciplines and philosophers where there's a big team, they apply for money, and then part of that money actually goes to the philosopher or the philosophy department. Yeah. So there's sometimes, I mean, it's not always the case, but sometimes the downside of that can be that this sort of philosophical work you get to do isn't necessarily all that interesting. So people just want to hear about, the ethical aspects of AI, and like, it's really, the engineering people who want to do AI, and then somebody tells them, oh, but you need to think about ethics, and then, they find a random philosopher who can, so,
Let's say that then I look for people who are, collaborate with an idea that you might have. And then,
exactly.
So be conscious about who you're applying it.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a quick, maybe also superficial question.
That's fine.
Because I also heard of examples when PhD applicants get a fund from indeed some kind of private organization or something like that. And I was just wondering, and this is something like this, do you perhaps know if there's some kind of overview on where people promote such?
That's
private funding.
Yeah. Hey, so it's a good question. So certainly some of those cases would be cases where someone has a job in a company, and that company wants, their employees to get PhD, so they partly fund it. That's one option. In terms of external funding for entire PhD projects, I don't know that there are a lot of those opportunities in the Netherlands. Are you, or you, Tara? Maybe?
Promoties in de geesteswetenschap.
Right, but that's the Research Council again. Yeah, so that, I mean, that's the program PhDs in Humanities by the Dutch Research Council, NWO.
There is at least one organization which funds people in the PhD programs. I can't remember what it is. For instance, you might have a PhD place, let's say in Oxford, they have the money, but the Dutch where it's based in the.
Yeah,
His name escapes me, but I can check it out.
that'd be great. Yeah,
No, it's not American.
Yeah.
It's Dutch.
okay, okay. Yeah, enough.
But it's
not
very small,
very few positions.
yeah.
Yeah.
Micro.
Right. Yeah, so I think sometimes in other disciplines, so for example, in biomedical research, there's these patient organizations that, provide a lot of money for research funding, and certainly those sorts of projects can involve PhD projects as well. But again, for philosophy, it's, I'm not aware of, yeah.
I know one example.
Okay.
From our university where there's a PhD student who is doing a PhD on Nietzsche, and he gets his funds from like some kind of religious organization.
I know what you mean. I'm not sure.
I don't know the exact
Sure.
organization, but he had indeed had some funds to do research on Nietzsche.
Right. You were,
Those examples do exist, so I thought maybe there's a whole few of that. But I guess they are rare, so I guess.
yeah, it might, yeah, so maybe it's not structural, right? Maybe like some cases you find someone or some organization who's that's interested in a particular project, but they might not be, giving out these grants every year or a couple of years. Yeah. If it's on Nietzsche, you would expect it to be an religious organization. Okay, so it's 2:30, so over to Nora, I think. Go for it. I'll change the presentation. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. Everybody hear me well? Or not? All right, so on to a very, very different topic, although connected in the sense that I started dealing with systematic literature reviews in the context of a interdisciplinary or at least multidisciplinary research project on extreme beliefs. So the project in which I'm doing my PhD is called Extreme Beliefs, the Epistemology and Ethics of Fundamentalism. And as the title said, it's a bunch of philosophers who think about fundamentalism, fundamentalist beliefs, conceptual issues, but also ethical issues, epistemological issues. Well, kind of broad exploration of what philosophers can bring to the table when engaging with more empirical research on fundamentalism and related phenomena. All right, so I had well, not that much of knowledge of fundamentalism when I started this project, so I needed to engage very, very quickly with a very, very large bulk of non-philosophical empirical literature on fundamentalism. And that was quite challenging. And this is how I discovered the method of systematic literature reviews. And that's what I'm going to discuss today. And I thought it's interesting to zoom in on literature reviews in general, but then systematic literature reviews in particular, because as philosophers, that's kind of what we do all the time, review literature. So we look for literature that's relevant, we read the literature, we assess the literature, we find it everywhere. So many papers start with a short literature review to embed their research, to identify a certain gap or an argument they want to engage with. But I think we're rarely conscious of what exactly we're doing when we are engaging with that literature and how, so we rarely reflect how we identify the literature, or how we select it, how we assess what is relevant and what isn't. And that's kind of especially problematic in this time where so much is published and where it's really hard to orientate in this enormous amount of publications that we are confronted with, but also to keep up with the pace of what is being published, right? And for philosophers, this might be not the most pressing problem, but in other disciplines, and the method of systematic reviews comes from non-philosophical disciplines, so more like empirical, biomedical sciences, health science, etc. For them, this is a really big issue because they need to be up to date on all the evidence, especially when they want to inform policy, for example. So they sat down and thought of a good systematic method to keep track of all the literature that is being published. And this method has kind of, well, more and more being used by social scientists and scholars from humanities. And recently the discussion also started on whether or not we should use this for philosophy. So in the rest of my, 25 minutes or so, I want to provide or give you an overview of what systematic reviews are, and also reflect a little on what they can do for philosophy. Right, and I'm going to do this as follows. So I'll first zoom in on the question, what types of literatures are there? So I'll distinguish very broadly between systematic and non-systematic reviews. Then I'll reflect briefly on the question how systematic reviews can be used for in philosophy or by philosophers. And then I'll walk you step by step through this method of systematic reviews, and I'll refer to my own research as an example, because I hope it illustrates this very, very otherwise dry and abstract introduction to methodology. And then I'll return to the question of traditional versus systematic reviews for philosophy. And then if there's time, I can walk you through some handy resources in case you want to do a systematic review yourself after this presentation. Oh, sorry. Before I really delve into the subject, I'd actually be curious to hear from you what you do when you search literature. So imagine that, I don't know, you want to write a paper and you don't know all the relevant literature yet. So what steps do you take to find the literature? And then anything goes. I'm just curious to hear how you go about this. Yes.
I search about literature reviews.
Yes. Very smart. Yeah.
Ask for expert advice.
Right. Yeah. Good. Yes.
Stanford Encyclopedia.
Yeah. Yeah. Always a good starting point. Yeah. Yes.
I often try to sort of create different keywords for the same question or thing that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
So if I'm interested in, say, what Adorno has to say about subject-object relations, I try to come up with different ways of asking about this in different search engines.
Right. Yeah. And then which search engines do you use?
Nowadays, I don't get names, it's a lot of Google Scholar. I'm sure that I check for like peer review stuff.
Yeah.
But also university library website.
Yeah.
Often Google, and then it leads you to other literature reviews or like more accessible blogs that refer to literature.
Oh, that's also really cool. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Right. So I saw some more hands, but for the sake of time, thanks for all the input. I did my own little survey in the PhD room, and many of the things you say kind of pop up again. And I think some of you are even more systematic than some of the PhDs at the field here, in the sense that you actually look for reviews, which is already a really, really good first step. Well, the other things that came up were, of course, ask a supervisor, just ask colleagues, yeah, encyclopedia entries that were already mentioned. So yeah, this all of that is what we call a traditional literature review. And traditional reviews are reviews that where you actually, well, you do a bunch of stuff and you have ideas, but often the ideas of why you do what you do are not explicit. And so you're not really transparent of how you find the literature and, well, what steps you take, right? So you don't really develop an explicit methodology. And that's fine for many, many purposes. Often those, well, let's call it heuristics, as for example, asking experts what should I read, right, is very efficient and brings you to the point. But the results of such traditional reviews have also been criticized in the light of this enormous information or publication overload that we have. So it's hard to have this full overview. It's hard to keep up with the pace. Also, so there's a lot of call for interdisciplinary research, as Jeroen mentioned, but often publications are kind of organized in a disciplinary way, right? And for me, this was really challenging when starting on the fundamentalism project, that there's a lot of disciplines engaging with the subject. And so I don't know any of these disciplines very well. So it was quite hard to, well, or at least understand which disciplines are engaged in the conversation, but also how to access relevant publications from them. So that also makes those kind of traditional methods more difficult, because I might not know an expert in psychology who can tell me you should read this and this and this on fundamentalism. And well, kind of the last big criticism that has prompted systematic reviews to become more prominent is that we also see this diversification of the researchers' body, right? So it's, well, people from different identity backgrounds, et cetera, come together, and this change in the composition of researchers has also shed light onto biases, injustices, boundaries, etc. And they also are reflected in our citation behavior. And in doing traditional reviews, there is this risk that you just cite all the same voices that are somewhere established as experts over and over again, right? So to kind of open up and maybe make our citation practices more just, systematic reviews might actually be one way to go, or at least that's what I think. Okay, so but we have talked a lot about systematic reviews, but what exactly are systematic reviews? And this is what we'll delve into in much more detail. But very broadly, we can say that a systematic review shares with a traditional review that both reviews want to identify and assess and analyze relevant publications, but systematic reviews, as the name says, do so systematically. So they specify which databases they use, they specify which search method they use, they specify how to select the studies they include, and also how they analyze and synthesize them. So far, so good. Are there any questions at the moment? So I'll walk through all the systematic steps in a bit, but is everything clear so far? Yes.
Is there like a set way of doing this, or a set program, or software, or?
Yeah, so there are methodological steps, and I'll come back to them. But there's also great diversity in types of systematic reviews. And I won't have time to really go through that, but I'll show you one, and I'll also point you to some references if you want to read up on this. And I can, so sadly, the literature on this is extremely boring, but very yeah. All right. So having a hopefully broad understanding of what systematic reviews are, you might question why, as philosophers, we should know about this, or why this might be relevant. And maybe I should start by saying that this might not be relevant for every philosophy project. So sometimes philosophers engage in very narrow debates, or they want to tackle this very narrow argument, right? And it's, I don't know whether it can be used for these cases as well, but maybe, so maybe you have ideas on how this can help this type of philosophy. But I think especially for philosophers who have, or who engage with empirical literature, who do more applied philosophy, such as, for example, political epistemologists, or many philosophers of mind right now that engage with, I don't know, psychological research, for example. For them, I think this method might be super helpful to have this overview on all, well, this massive amount of publications they should actually treat, to keep up with the pace, to avoid certain biases such as confirmation bias, so that you kind of prioritize evidence that already underwrites or supports the hypotheses you have, but also to mitigate well, the implicit biases or epistemic injustices that I already mentioned before. Then there's also this availability or salience bias. So things we know, we give more credence. So that in this sense, the kind of order in which we receive information already biases us to information that we received earlier, which is of course not a legitimate way of assessing information, but this is what we do as humans, studies have shown. And systematic reviews might be a way to also mitigate that. So yeah, so I think for philosophers engaging with empirical evidence, systematic reviews can be super helpful. And I think also for philosophers who do not do much of applied work, it might be helpful when you're new to a field, for example, or when you want to update your knowledge and you want to make sure that in updating your knowledge, you don't miss out on maybe voices who aren't that big yet, right? So in that sense, it might also be, or also philosophers, of course, are liable to all these biases that I discussed before. So you might think that for them, it's also relevant to engage in systematic reviews. All right. And I'll return to this question towards the end of the presentation, once hopefully you have a bit of a better understanding what systematic reviews are. Okay, so how do you do a systematic review? And I'll walk you through the steps of systematic reviews by reference to my own research. So I conducted with Rick Pils, who isn't here today, and 2 other colleagues, we conducted a scoping review in the context of the Extreme Beliefs Project. And maybe let me tell you something of why we decided to do a scoping review and what a scoping review is. So first of all, and this is, I'm not going to nuance that much, but a scoping review, strictly speaking, is not a systematic, but a semi-systematic review. This has to do with a technicality that I'm not going into, so forget that nuance. We decided, or so what a scoping review is that it's, as the name says, it provides you with a broad scope of the literature. So it's a method, a type of systematic reviews or semi-systematic reviews that is suitable for interdisciplinary work, because you don't need to limit your literature search to one discipline, and it gives you a really broad overview of the literature you address. Other methods require you to be more specific on what you're looking into, broad or narrow to frame the research question, etc., etc. So why did we decide to do a scoping review? We did a scoping review to do conceptual work, because one of the aims in the project is to come up with a good definition of fundamentalism, but there's no clear usage or meaning of the term fundamentalism in the academic research right now. So people disagree on how broad the scope of the term is or how broad its extension should be. So to which phenomena should the notion be applied? They also disagree on the conceptual component parts or building blocks. So there's just a lot of disagreement. They disagree on what types of fundamentalism there are. Are there only religious ones? Are there secular ones? So this debate or this lack of consensus made it really hard to do conceptual work in a more traditional sense. And this is why we thought, okay, let's more systematically map this debate on the notion of fundamentalism. And now I'll walk you through the steps. So step 1 is to develop a method. And this is what you then call, or that product, or what comes out of this first step is a review protocol. So basically you sit down and you think, what do I want to do? And how will I do this? And then you try to write this down as explicitly as possible. So you provide information on the rationale of your study. So why do you do it? And what's your specific research question? But also what kind of literature do you need to answer this research question? And all these considerations then guide you to the method. So you choose a method. So systematic reviews in general already are a method, but there's a lot of different types. So you need to think which type fits the purpose or aim of your scoping or systematic review best. For us, this was a scoping review because of the reasons I mentioned earlier. So a lot of literature that we wanted to dig through, but also literature spread out over many, many disciplines. Then you specify where you plan to look for relevant literature. So you specify the information sources. And here maybe it's interesting to know that you cannot use Google Scholar for a systematic review because the search engine is structured in a way that it's not fit for a systematic review. Then you specify your search strategy. So you specify which search terms you use, but also how you connect them with Boolean operators. And also where you want these keywords or search terms to appear. So do you want them to appear in the title? Do you want them to appear in the abstract, in the keywords, or also in the whole text? So these are all considerations that you need to take into account. And here we work with a librarian, and otherwise this would not have been possible. So I would never have thought of all these questions. Then you have to specify how you select all the publications that you find, and also what information exactly you're looking for. So for us, this was definitions, but other people look for numbers and statistics, significances, etc., etc. And you also need to plan how you analyze and synthesize it. So not only what information, but also how do you get this information and how do you bring this information together to answer your research question. And then lastly, so one reason to do a systematic review is to be transparent. And in order to encourage transparency, many people choose to pre-register this review protocol. So you write your plan down, and before you actually start with all the searches, you can upload the review protocol to this website. So we chose the Open Science Foundation, where this is registered. And then when you submit the final review to a journal, they can check, did you actually do what you planned to do, or were you kind of biased in the application or the conduct of the review. All right. So having all the or this plan, the first real step is to conduct the literature searches. I didn't do this. This was a librarian. Her name was Linda, and it was great because she knows all the different databases and also how to search on these databases. All these databases work slightly differently, so you have to spell, for example, the keywords slightly differently or connect them in a slightly different sense, right? So she did all the searches and she sent us a file. For us, it was a huge file of more than 7,000 titles and abstracts. So that's the result of the searches. And here is very messy, on this very messy slide, you can see all the search paths she documented per database. And that's also something you have to submit when you submit the scoping review or the systematic review. All right, so then we had this file with 7,000 articles, and we were quite desperate because it was much more than we thought. And of course, it's not feasible to read that amount of articles. So we needed, and that's luckily we already had thought about this, how will we select and screen these articles, right? So remember that I talked about this eligibility criteria that you already have to make explicit in your review protocols in this method of plan. Right, so on the for you left-hand side, you see the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So we had before doing the search already thought of, okay, when we get all these results, which articles are relevant for us, which are not. And so one example of an inclusion criteria was an article that explicitly defines or conceptualizes or operationalizes the notion of fundamentalism. But we would exclude them if they treated a different sense of fundamentalism. So we were looking for fundamentalism as a social movement, but you also have root fundamentalism, which I think is a metaphysical position. I really don't know actually, but this is not the phenomenon we're looking at, right? So we also had to think of what other senses of fundamentalism that we're not interested in might come up. And then we screened in 2 rounds. So in the first round, and that's we did with 3 authors, because so this is how you ensure reliability, that you all apply the criteria in more or less the same way. So we screened through all the titles and abstracts and checked, do they apply to our inclusion criteria and do they not match our exclusion criteria. So this is called the title and abstract screening. And then after this title and abstract screening, so you can actually see the stages of the screening on the right-hand side, we had a bit more than 1,000 papers left, and then we did a full text screening. So you repeat this entire process and go through the full text really quickly. So you just check, does it match your criteria or not? All right. And then we had I think it was like 715 or 14 or so articles that we analyzed. And so I'm not going to zoom in too much into the analysis part, because how you choose to analyze the publications really depends on your research questions. So all the steps so far are kind of the same for any systematic review, but the analysis part, well, you kind of tailor it to your aim. But what is common to all reviews is that you have two types of results you present. So you have descriptive results that really just describe the publication. So for example, when are they published, from which discipline are they, in which journal, etc., etc. And you have the more, so for us, this was qualitative data, so the data you actually use to answer your research questions. So for us, these were 3 types of data. So we looked into conceptual building blocks. We wanted to have an inventory of all the conceptual building blocks. We looked into the scope of the term, so how broad is the notion used. And we looked into the different kinds of fundamentalism that came up. So for example, Christian fundamentalism, but also feminist fundamentalism, which was something I had never heard of before. And then one problem for us was that there were much more conceptual building blocks that we identified than we thought. So we had, I think, 320 or so conceptual building blocks. So we needed to think about a way to organize them. And this is a kind of higher order analysis or a more abstract analysis. So we clustered them, I'll show in this next slide, into 5 categories and subcategories to make this manageable in some sense. All right, so the final step is the presentation of results, and you're not allowed to be very creative in that, I think. So you have a strict reporting requirement, which is called the PRISMA requirement, the reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. I'll not dive into this, but if you Google PRISMA checklist, you can find a lot of documents that instruct you on how to document your research. All right, I'll hurry up a bit. All right, so then this brings me to actually back to the question of what can philosophers do with this. So now hopefully you have a broad idea of what a systematic review is, and also some first thoughts of whether or not it can be useful in philosophy, and also how to conduct one. So having said this, I actually want to start with some words of warning. So a systematic review is extremely time consuming, and this is something I had heard before, but I thought somehow it would be different for me. It is not. It took me 2 years, and it's not the nicest process. So it has a lot of benefits, and I can really recommend it when you know why you're doing it, but don't start without a really good reason to do one. So that's the first thing I really, first advice. Then a problem might be that you need multiple authors. So you need people equally committed to do all the work with you. And that's a pretty strict requirement in order to publish something as a systematic review, because this multiple authorship also enables you to make it more, or to ensure that it's reliable what you're doing. Then it's good to realize that while systematic reviews might help us to minimize certain biases, they don't help us to minimize biases that are in the literature. So for example, for fundamentalism, you can observe a pretty strong anti-Islam bias. Well, we can kind of report on this, but it's not anything we can do about by conducting a systematic review. And another downfall is that while one reason to conduct a systematic review is transparency, but oftentimes the databases you use are not transparent at all. So most of us don't know how those search engines work. When they're AI powered, we don't know how the machine learning works and how this influences what we see and what we find. It's also often unclear how these engines deal with translations and how well they are aware of, for example, synonyms in different languages, right? And it can also be that the meaning we want to convey with these search algorithms, so this strings of search terms and operators, the meaning we want to convey gets lost. So we're not sure whether the engine understands this in some sense, right? So those are things that limit the transparency. yeah, so it's a good tool, but not usable for any research project. And oftentimes traditional reviews can do just fine. And I hope that the takeaway is that from everything I said is that, you know, there are options and that maybe you're also prompted to think through and reflect a little more. At least that's what I do since I conducted a systematic review, to reflect more and think through how you search literature and how you select it and what often implicit criteria you have and how you can make them explicit. And then I won't have time to go through that, but if you want to read up, here are some helpful resources. For the two middle papers, they're actually really nice papers written by a philosopher who reflects on, well, what systematic reviews can do for us. Thanks. And if there are any questions, please let me know.
Yeah, so for the first part of the presentation, the review protocol, I
Yeah.
was wondering, is that something that you use as kind of a guidance, you know, before you start writing the main paper, or is that something that you actually include within the literature review as sort of like a method section?
So I used many parts of it. I used as a method in the method section because you already described your method, but it's a separate document. So it's a document that guides actually all the steps that follow and that you can reflect on. So if things don't work out as they should have, you can kind of point back and say, so this was the plan, this is why it didn't work, and this is how we adjusted it. So it's a kind of, there's this function of for you to make a plan, but also to be transparent of how you conducted the plan and whether and how it worked out or not. Is it clear? Yeah.
I had a question about just research for something in the pictures that's used that okay?
Yeah, sure.
What would count as a metaphysical behavior or emotion?
Yeah, okay, so I'm not so happy anymore with this choose of terminology, but so we try to cluster all these different conceptual component parts, right? And for example, for Christian fundamentalists, they had often these being born again experience. So in order to qualify as a fundamentalist, according to some authors, you needed to have this being born again experience. So the emotions attached to that, we would then call a kind of metaphysical emotion, but this was more for us a categorization of, or like a clustering to see which component parts fit together. And a metaphysical behavior would be bidding, for example. So we wanted to make the category a bit broader than merely religious, because we also encountered non-religious fundamentalisms, but we thought it had to have something transcendent. But yeah, the choice of terms, I'm not so sure anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have the following suggestion.